There's a certain allure to things that seem attainable, tangible, and yet not quite right. The possibility that something you wouldn't normally give a second thought might actually hold some sort of secret or mystery is inspiring, particularly in a world that often feels so stiflingly mundane. It gives us a sense of awe and wonder to consider the idea that the fantastical might be hidden in plain sight all around us, or, perhaps, even right beneath our feet. There are countless myths, legends, and stories about what might lie below us. This is only the first part of what I hope to be a series on the topic, covering mysteries in the depths. In this particular video, we'll be looking at two famous and pretty much debunked urban legends, but to end on a high note, we'll close out with an incredible location that is incredibly mysterious and also entirely real. I hope y'all enjoy. Well to Hell. In 1989, reports began to circulate that scientists in Russia had, in the process of drilling a hole deep into the earth, accidentally broken through into hell. The story goes that the Russian engineers in Siberia had reached 8.9 miles, 14.4 kilometers, in depth when their drill bit began to spin freely, an indication that they'd reached an empty cavern. They withdrew the drill and decided to replace it with a heat-resistant microphone. As they lowered the microphone into the depths, temperatures reached 1100 degrees Celsius, approximately 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the microphone could only survive a short time before melting. But the audio that the engineers could record was enough to terrify them. The scream of thousands, if not millions, of voices echoed from the hollow chamber deep within the earth. I won't leave you in any sort of suspense here. This tale is an urban legend. But it's one of the most interesting types of urban legend, in that the very basic premise for the story is, at least partially, true. There really was a drilling project deep in Russia that drilled miles into the earth. This was the Kola Super Deep Borehole, located on the Kola Peninsula close to the borders of Finland and Norway. The Kola Super Deep Borehole project began drilling in 1970, and a number of interesting finds were made during the course of this project. These included an unexpected layer of water deep within the earth, microscopic fossils of plankton found at 4 miles, or about 6.3 kilometers below the surface, large amounts of hydrogen gas, and temperatures that were 80 degrees Celsius, 144 degrees Fahrenheit, higher than expected. The heat and pressure reportedly caused the rock at that depth to behave more like plastic than rock, which made it incredibly difficult to drill through without the hole just collapsing as they went. But despite these issues, as well as the equipment breakdowns and a lack of funding, in 1989 the Kola Super Deep Borehole had officially become the deepest artificial point on Earth, at a depth of 12.26 kilometers, or approximately 7.6 miles. It's probably not a coincidence that 1989, the year that the Kola Super Deep Borehole reached the deepest point ever drilled, is the same year that the rumor about reaching hell seems to have begun. The parallels between the urban legend and the real story are immediately apparent, from the high temperatures to the location being in Russia. But how did this scientific endeavor become twisted into a religious story? The story, or at least what's known of it, is actually a little more interesting than might be expected. Although this myth didn't actually start with the Trinity Broadcasting Network, that's where it gained widespread attention. At some point in the second half of 1989, TBN broadcasted a story called Scientists Discover Hell, which claimed Russian scientists had drilled into a cavern of immense temperatures and heard the screams of countless souls trapped within the depths. This story was heard by many viewers of the network and immediately began to spread around, at some point reaching two particular individuals who become important to the history of this legend. One of these people was Rich Bueller, a pastor and talk show host who also created the site trutherfiction.com, which serves as a Snopes-like fact-checking site, originally specifically for urban legends. His talk show received many calls in the early 1990s about the TBN story, and so he began to research the legend and found what is the most complete history that we know of its origins. Rich started with the Trinity Broadcasting Network, looking into their supposed sources. Their primary source was a Finnish newspaper called Anastasia, that Trinity Broadcasting Network claimed to be highly reputable, but in actuality was a monthly religious newsletter that was never intended to be a source of journalistic or scientific information. The other source was sent by a teacher from Norway named O. Randalen and was a translation of an article from a Norwegian newspaper. Except it wasn't. As it turned out, O had been visiting the USA on a trip when he first heard the well to hell myth, and he was so amazed that people believed it that he decided to do an experiment. He found a Norwegian newspaper article about a building inspector, made up a fake translation and caption, and claimed it to be about a cover-up of the well to hell, and then sent that to TBN, along with a letter about his discovery of the article. He included his contact info, as well as the contact info of a friend who was a pastor in California, who Al said would corroborate his story. However, this friend was actually in on the story and had agreed to reveal the hoax if anyone called to verify it with him. But Trinity Broadcasting Network didn't bother, and so this hoax was reported as fact and became supporting evidence for the discovery. When contacted by Rich, O readily explained this entire story, and therefore this piece of evidence can be completely thrown out. But there was still the original source that needed to be followed up on, which Rich did. He spoke with the staff from the newsletter Audionautix, which told Rich that their story was a retelling of a letter from a Finnish newspaper, Etelä-Suomen. When that newspaper was asked for their source, they found out in the records that it had originated as a letter sent to them by a reader. Rich was able to then find the person who wrote that letter, who told him that their letter in turn had been based on a story that the writer had seen in the Christian newsletter Violet in July of 1989. Violet had, in turn, also received the story as a submission from a reader. That reader's source was supposedly Jules of Jericho, a messianic newspaper in California. Unfortunately, Rich was unable to trace this any further, and after a brief search on my end, I couldn't find anything to indicate anyone else has either. So, ultimately, what do we know about the origin of this story? We know that it was primarily, with the exception of Etelä-Suomen, reported in religious newspapers or newsletters. We also know that it was passed along through reader submissions rather than any primary source investigations. We know that the story jumped from America to Finland and then back to America, all within a single year, and that it's entirely possible that it crossed the ocean another time before that. Due to Finland's proximity with the Kola super deep borehole, it seems reasonable to assume it might have been the starting place for the legend. We also know that the urban legend didn't stop at the Trinity Broadcasting Network. Online versions, with and without accompanying pictures, have continued to circulate, and in the late 90s, a new element was added. This was the recording that had supposedly been made in the well to hell before the microphone melted away, consisting of a 17-second long clip of the screams of the damned, and just like every other completely true thing on the internet, you can find this on YouTube if you look for it. As you can doubtlessly guess, the audio is most likely fake. Although some sites claim that the audio comes from a movie called Barren Blood, that seems to be unconfirmed, but the editing and looping of the audio is apparent, and it's more than enough reason to throw this out as a fake. Something so easy to fabricate, especially so many years after the initial story and with no proof of where it comes from, means that this is very likely not legitimate. So ultimately, although we don't know exactly where this legend originated from, it was likely either a scary story based in fact that was then taken to be fact itself through a game of telephone, or a purposefully misleading version of real events that was then spread through its sensationalistic nature. But whatever the true origin might be, it's safe to assume we haven't drilled our way into hell. Yet. Mel's Hole. In February 1997, listeners to the late-night talk show Coast to Coast AM were treated to a fantastical and fascinating story. Coast to Coast AM is a talk show that still runs to this day, discussing the paranormal and other fringe topics, conducting interviews, and allowing callers to tell their stories. It was one of those callers, a man who called himself Mel Waters, that began the legend of what's now known as Mel's Hole. To use a description that I saw on melshole.org, which I absolutely loved, Mel's Hole is a geographical anomaly. It supposedly exists in Washington state, about 9 miles from Ellensburg and possibly in the Menashtash Ridge, and it was originally on Mel's property before being seized by the government. The hole itself is an open pit in the ground, which Mel claimed holds supernatural properties. Some of these properties include a beam of shadows emitting from the hole, radios brought near the hole playing music and radio shows from the past, and, most eerily, the ability to bring animals back to life. Mel tells the story of a neighbor who, instead of burying their recently deceased dog's body, decided to put it in the hole. But to Mel's shock, that same dog was later seen perfectly alive, accompanying a hunter through the woods. Mel also claimed that the hole was impossibly deep, perhaps even endless. Using spools of weighted fishing line tied together, Mel measured 80,000 feet, or 24.4 kilometers, or 15.2 miles, without hitting the bottom of the pit. To give context and comparison for that depth, the deepest known natural cave is Veryovkina Cave in Abkhazia, a contested region in the country of Georgia, and this cave reaches a depth of 2.2 kilometers or 1.4 miles of vertical depth. The Kola super deep borehole is still to this day the deepest human-made hole at 12.26 kilometers or approximately 7.6 miles. The Challenger Deep of the Mariana Trench is the deepest known point on Earth at approximately 10.9 kilometers or 6.78 miles below sea level. The crust of the Earth, which is the outermost layer of the planet, ranges from a minimum of about 4.8 kilometers or 3 miles thick at some locations within the ocean to a maximum of about 80.5 kilometers or 50 miles in some portions of the continental crust. In Washington, where Mel's Hole is, the crust averages about 29.8 kilometers or 18.5 miles thick, but the ends of this range are pretty wide. This means that at 24.4 kilometers deep and counting, Mel's Hole was not only twice as deep as the Kola Super Deep Borehole, but it reached most of the way through the crust, if not all the way through. If you have any interest in geology or planetary sciences, you can probably tell right away that this really is not possible. Even assuming the hole was somehow able to maintain its shape without collapsing in on itself due to the heat and pressure, there's no possible way that Mel could have lowered a fishing line 15 miles into the earth, let alone done so and gotten an accurate measurement of the depth. So, even discounting the supernatural elements of this story regarding beams of shadow and the resurrection of animals, Mel's Hole can't exist. Or can it? Perhaps not in the way that Mel told the story, but in terms of there being a mysterious pit in the ground, cordoned off so that no one can access it, perhaps there is some truth there. Jack Powell, a geologist with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, heard the story and thought that he had an idea of the inspiration behind it. An abandoned gold mine not far from Ellensburg was fenced off with barbed wire and descended into the ground at least 90 feet, or 27.4 meters, with a much greater depth when it was originally in use. Powell believed that it was likely this hole that was the inspiration for the fantastic story of Mel's Hole. But that hasn't stopped believers. To this day, they still search the Menashtash Ridge, hoping to one day find Mel's Hole and prove its existence and incredible properties to the world. Devil's Hole. Devil's Hole is quite a dramatic name, but this cave hidden within Death Valley National Park in Nevada earns it many ways. As well as being in the midst of a famously hot and dry desert, the water in Devil's Hole is hot itself, averaging around 91 degrees Fahrenheit or 33 degrees Celsius throughout. This is a much higher temperature than the water of most caves. And that still isn't all, as this cave also earns its name from how incredibly mysterious it is, and for reasons that are completely real. But for something cute to start off with, Devil's Hole is the home of a unique species of fish called a Devil's Hole pupfish. These are little fish, 30 millimeters or 1.2 inches, that range in color from pale yellow to metallic blue and are called pupfish because of their playful, active natures. A lot about these fish is still unknown, such as how they came to inhabit Devil's Hole to begin with, but in recent years they've been the subject of study and conservation efforts that have increased their population from a low of 35 individuals in 2013 to a current 263 in 2022. But pupfish aside, the geological system of Devil's Hole is also fascinating in itself. The surface of the pool is about 30 feet below ground level and is on a slope that allows someone to just kind of walk down into the pool. Just below the surface is a rocky ledge, which is incredibly important for the pupfish life cycle. Diving below the surface, the initial room is about 23 meters or 75 feet deep, and its floor is made up of collapsed rocks that have wedged themselves into place. A small passage through the rocks allows a diver to continue further into the cave, and upon exiting this passage, they enter into a massive room called Acre's Chamber. This room is also known as Acre's Chasm, and it earns its name as well. Its largest section is 91 meters or approximately 298 feet by 12 meters or approximately 39 feet. The ceiling of Acre's Chamber has a few small tunnels that all lead to the same place, a location called Brown's Room, which is partially above the water table and contains an air pocket. This room is, like the rest of the cave, covered with calcite deposits, and these calcite deposits provide a valuable geological record of the development of the cave. Because part of the room is above water, it also gives insight to the height of the water table over time, and this makes Brown's Room a particularly interesting area of study. But as interesting and unusual as all of this is, and as many questions still remain about the history and formation of Devil's Hole, these are far from the only unknowns about this cave, and one of those unknowns lies at the bottom of Acre's Chamber. The floor of the room is shaped like a funnel, shallower at the edges and sloping downward toward the center. But even in the incredibly clear waters of the cave, shining a light downward only reveals seemingly endless darkness below. Diver Jim Houts, who made many dives in Devil's Hole, including an attempted rescue after 2 young men went missing in the cave in 1965, reached a depth of about 96 meters or 315 feet without reaching the bottom, and he said of the cave, "It's like infinity." Later dives done in 1991 as a part of the U.S. Geological Society were focused mainly on the science and the history of the cave's formation, as well as the habitat of the pupfish, but divers did look for the bottom of Acre's Chamber. A depth of about 133 meters, or about 436 feet, was reached, with divers reporting that they could see down to about 150 meters, or 500 feet, but that the passage continued into the darkness with no end in sight. Because of the pupfish's endangered status, dives into Devil's Hole are highly regulated, and no further attempts to find the bottom of the cave have been made. The water level in Devil's Hole reacts to seismic activity as far away as Alaska, and during a quake in Mexico in 2012, video captured the water in the Devil's Hole surging and receding rhythmically. A nearby cave, confusingly called Devil's Hole Cave as opposed to simply Devil's Hole, is believed to be connected with Devil's Hole, but no passage between them has been found yet. Wells dug in the area in the past have also been shown to directly affect the water level of Devil's Hole, indicating a massive underground lake or aquifer that exists underneath the desert. On a final tragic note, as alluded to previously, 2 divers went missing in the cave in 1965. Brothers-in-law Paul Giancontieri and David Rose were lost in the cave during an illegal dive. Their friend Bill Alter accompanied them on the dive, while Bill's brother Jack waited for the group on the surface and kept a lookout. Bill, Paul, and David dove together and reached Acree's chamber, but were running out of air and decided to return. Bill and David returned to the surface safely, but upon realizing Paul wasn't with them, they dove once more to look for him. Bill was the only one to return, later stating that David had been ahead of him, but that Bill had dived to 53 meters or 175 feet and couldn't find either David or Paul before he had to return to the surface. Although rescue divers hoped that Paul and David might be found in Brown's room, searches of the room and its passages turned up no sign of the missing divers. They were also not in the main chamber or in the tunnel from the main chamber, so that left only Acree's chasm. Although divers scoured what they could reach of the massive chamber, including Jim Houts making his dive to 96 meters or 315 feet, all they could find were assorted pieces of equipment, a flashlight, a mask, and a fin. Despite the subsequent dives down to 133 meters, or 436 feet, no further trace of the 2 missing divers has ever been found, and it's likely that their bodies lie somewhere in the seemingly infinite depths. And there we have it. 2 legends and a real mystery, and this is only barely scratching the surface, pun intended, of this topic. I know of several legends and real places I'd like to talk about, but I'm also very interested in suggestions. Please feel free to leave a comment for anything you'd like to see featured in another part of this series. I also tried a slightly different editing style for this video, as I'm still kind of figuring out what works for me and what suits the topics and that sort of thing, but I'm open to constructive feedback on that, so please feel free to leave your opinions. But yeah, that's it. I hope you enjoyed, and I will hopefully see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.